So there I was, standing outside the US Embassy in Buenos Aires. The year was 1995, and I just quit my first real job a few months earlier so I could backpack through Central and South America. I'd left home in my mid-20s, like many travelers do, I suppose, to immerse myself in other cultures, and perhaps in the process, to understand home a little better, to put some distance between myself and the United States, that vast, weltering, confusing national community, so I could perhaps understand it a little better. But now, I was stuck, some 6,000 miles away, because my passport had been stolen 2 days earlier. As you might imagine, I was a bit worried. Standing there outside that drab concrete and glass block of an embassy, I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening. When would I be able to move on? What did this loss mean for my eventual return? I'd spent the previous 48 hours getting my paperwork in order, and now I was entering a bureaucratic tangle that might not release me for who knew how long. Well, in the end, I was fortunate, receiving a replacement passport in little more than a week. But the experience had made visceral something that I'd barely sensed before, that the passport, for all of its promise of adventure and opportunity, escape and safe haven, binds you to home. It binds you to a state bureaucracy. It also binds you to a national community in a way that no other document, not your driver's license, well, not even your birth certificate does. Now, all these years later, as an English professor and cultural historian, I'm still gripped by these documents. In the last 2 decades, journalists and scholars have given more and more attention to passports as international travel has accelerated, as migrant crises have worsened, as concerns about disease have, well, escalated dramatically. Passports are usually viewed through the lenses of law, security, and surveillance. But as a humanist, I'm also interested in the stories that attach themselves to these little booklets, to the odd mixture of emotions and imaginings, the feelings of being pushed and pulled, bound and released that are contained in our passports. Now, a quick glimpse at the stamping pages of a current US passport bears this out. In the background, we see a series of, well, patriotic images, each headed with quotations from the likes of George Washington and Teddy Roosevelt. They seem to say that there's no place like home, that there's really no reason to go abroad at all. But once those same pages are adorned with colorful entry stamps and visas, they begin to tell another story of our contact with a broader community beyond the bounds of a singular home. This is the paradox of the passport. On the one hand, that little booklet connects you with a particular national community. The seal on the cover, the language inside, they speak to your contact with a particular country, with a particular society. On the other hand, of course, the passport allows you to leave, to abandon your country for another, at least for a time. It permits you to seek out new affiliations, new ways of living, perhaps even that safe haven far from home. So with the help of a few old documents, I'd like to take us on a brief journey back to the beginnings of the modern passport so that we can explore this paradox a little bit further. But let me begin with a rather odd detail from one of the most famous books of the 20th century, James Joyce's Ulysses. The novel dedicates more than 700 pages to the description of a single day in Ireland, taking in the full scope of Irish society in the process. So if you make it to the end, and very few readers do on the first try, it's true, you might be surprised to find this brief geographical epilogue. Trieste, Zurich, Paris, 1914 to 1921. In his early 20s, Joyce had exiled himself from Ireland and taken up residence in Trieste, that busy port city on the northern end of the Adriatic Sea. In 1914, as he was beginning work on his masterpiece, he was just barely scraping by, supporting a young family on the pittance that he made as an English language teacher. Then, as if to make things more difficult, the First World War came to town. The passport as we know it was born of this global conflict. When Joyce had left home a decade earlier, he had no need of such a document. But now, in the name of national security, countries throughout Europe have begun to institute new measures to track and control movement across their borders. And now, with xenophobic and patriotic feelings running high, the passport became more than just a license to travel. It became an affirmation of your national identity. It bound you in some official way to a particular country. It placed you firmly on one side of the conflict or the other. Now, compelled to flee Trieste for Zurich in neutral Switzerland, Joyce soon arrived at the British consulate to secure a passport for himself and his family. This single sheet of paper, adorned with renewal stamps and visas, begins to fill in the details of Ulysses' epilogue. At the same time, and in much the same way as that massive book, it speaks to the complexity of Joyce's relationship with home. For one thing, it confirms that as he wrote that massive novel of Dublin, he never spent a single day in Ireland. Ulysses is a book we should recall modeled on Homer's Odyssey, that archetypal tale of the wandering hero who takes his sweet time, 10 years, to get home. Well, not long after Joyce settled in Paris to put the finishing touches on his novel, another writer, much younger and entirely unknown, arrived in the French capital from the United States. Langston Hughes would later become one of the most important voices in modern American poetry and one of the leaders of the Harlem Renaissance. But in 1924, he was the only African-American crewman on a merchant vessel called the SS Malone. Well, that is until he jumped ship in Rotterdam and made his way to the City of Lights. Hughes had secured his passport just a few years earlier so that he could visit his rather aloof father, who was living and working in Mexico City. Here we should recall that it wasn't always easy for a black man in segregationist America to attain a passport. Hughes' application, in fact, had required 2 affidavits, including one from his mother, who swore to his citizenship by virtue of his birth in Joplin, Missouri. As was often the case, the attending physician had failed to issue a birth certificate for the black child. So that makes what happened next even more poignant. After a sightseeing trip across northern Italy to Venice, Hughes was returning to Paris by train when his passport and wallet were stolen. He had pinned the valuables inside his coat, as his grandmother had taught him to do, but it didn't help when he fell asleep in the crowded third-class carriage. Unable to recross the French border, Hughes found himself stranded in Genoa, that busy port city on the Italian Riviera. The American consul there said that there was nothing he could do for the young man because he didn't have any identification papers with him at all. We might speculate about some other less official motives. So, growing hungrier and more desperate, Hughes pursued another option. He went down to the port and tried to get hired on as a deckhand so that he could catch a ride back to the US. But while he witnessed white sailors getting hired on with little or no trouble, he tried day after day with no luck. It was in these circumstances, far from home, deprived of his passport, denied a way back, that Hughes wrote one of his most enduring poems, I Too. The brief verse ends with a powerful assertion of his identity, his American identity, in the face of segregation and discrimination. Tomorrow, I'll sit at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I, too, am America. Here, then, are emotions and imaginings prompted by the loss of a passport, which left Hughes without protection, without mobility, untethered from home. An assertion that his life matters and that he deserves a rightful place in the American community. With little effort, we might even imagine those words inscribed on the stamping pages of a US passport. For Hughes, as for so many others, the passport is implicated in this sense of connection, attachment, even as it provides a distance critical to understanding where we come from. So, next time you hold your passport in your hand, or rifle through your drawers looking for it, I encourage you to spare a thought or two for the passports of James Joyce and Langston Hughes, and for how you might feel about home whenever you get where you're going. Spare a thought for the complications of belonging, for the push and pull, for the affiliation and ambivalence that are stored in that little document.